So I'd like to first start off by thanking Mayor Christensen and the Dover City Council for allowing us to use this room. It is a wonderful place to be. It's dry. And people know how to get here. So that makes it a very important thing. We are pleased to be able to do these series of talks. The Friends of Old Dover has a lot of people wanting to know, what are you going to be doing? Why does the Friends of Old Dover even exist? And if this isn't a good example of why such an organization exists, I don't know what is. Our speaker this morning is Bill Torbert. Actually, he's Bill Torbert Jr., I think.
No.
Third?
I'm the fourth Bill, but I am not a junior or a second or a third.
Okay. Well, for purposes of this discussion, we'll refer to him as Bill the Fourth.
There you go.
Bill is a graduate of the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science in 1981 and is the fourth generation of his family to be involved in the funeral homes and funeral chapel business here in Dover. That makes him an expert on the subject of the funeral homes and the cemeteries of Dover, Delaware. And it's for that reason that I'd like to introduce him now. Bill Torbert.
Thank you. And I have been addressed as the Grim Reaper, Digger Odell, just plain Digger. I've been stopped while in mid-conversation with someone and told that by someone else that I was measuring someone up. People come up and ask me how business is, and the answer is either it's dead or people are dying to come see me. The one thing that I don't like is people call me old clammy hands every once in a while. And the reason that gets to me is because it's actually true. Old hands, warm heart, I've been told. Also that my complexion is very good because of working with a formaldehyde. But just to let you know, anyone who is my age or around my age who took a bubble bath in Mr. Bubble has also had some exposure to formaldehyde. I want to start by talking about the different pictures that you're going to be seeing. And the one on the screen right now is just of the Richardson Hotel and the City Hall where it was initially, which was in the middle of Lockman Street. And then eventually they moved it to this location and then raised it and built this building. But that was a very middle time period in Dover's history. Dover was had flourishing businesses back then, and Lockerman Street was full of all kinds of businesses, including some funeral homes right on Lockerman Street. But we're going to step back a little bit further than that, and we're going to be talking about the Presbyterian Cemetery, the old Presbyterian Cemetery, not that there's a new one, and also Wesley's older chapel and cemetery that it was over on the corner of New Street and North Street, and then also Holy Cross for a little bit and a couple other cemeteries in the area, especially Christ Church, which is right around the corner from here. And let me get through the beginning pictures. Dover was set up around, of course, the green, and that was the center of town. Most of the cemeteries were just within a block or two of the center of town. And back in the day, which is a term that we'll say is back in time that I don't know exactly when someone died, they were buried very close to where they died, and usually with not a lot of fanfare, and then a service would be done separately. You were lucky to have a casket a lot of times because, especially if it were summer, it just had to be done with a lot of speed because nature was going to take its course. And so A lot of times they were wrapped in a sheet or buried just in what they were and marked with a simple placard that was made of wood or a stone. If someone was able to engrave on it, that was fine. If you had resources or money, a lot of times you could get a monument. And there were monument businesses, even in the early 1800s, that were right on Lockerman Street here, that sold stones. This is Christ Church, and the reason I started there was, of course, Caesar Rodney has a memorial there. Caesar Rodney died near his home and was buried near his home, and at some point after the land was acquired by other people, they weren't really sure where he was buried, as I was told years ago, but apparently they had a good idea, and they disinterred remains from the family cemetery and reinterred them in Christ Church and built a memorial that's there today. And they're even in the verbiage from Christ Church, who has an excellent pamphlet that has a walking tour of the cemetery. Even in their verbiage, they say that they're not really sure that it's his remains, but it's likely that it's someone from his family at least. But it's a wonderful monument, and if you get a chance to take a tour on a better day than today, it's very self-guided and a nice thing to do. And I believe that there are tours of the cemeteries at certain times of the year that are offered, and some of them are lantern tours, I believe, and they're very interesting. So if you get a chance, please do that. This is the Bonwill Monument, which is a huge granite structure that is built right in the front door of Christ Church. And the older Mr. Bonwill was a physician. His son was a dentist. And apparently he invented something called the electromagnetic dental hammer. I have no idea what that is, but he became rich because of it, and he decided that he would build this huge stone right out in front of the church. And I'm not sure if that was the front of the church at the time or if it was still the side of the church, because they have changed the positioning of the doors and entrances on that church. But if you see the small stones off to the side, someone said that it is rumored that he designed those smaller stones on the family plot to look like teeth. And this is just a few feet away from the Bonwill stone. And this is the burial space that has the Lockermans and the Bradfords and the Johnsons. The Johnsons' home is actually just across Water Street from Christ Churchyard. And it's only been vacant for a small amount of time when Holly Johnson passed away just a few years ago. But there's a lot of history in the churchyard there. And if you look over to the right side of the screen, you'll see a slab that has been lettered, and the lettering on that has the person's name and age and a description and some other information, but the important thing is the brick structure underneath of that. And my brother and I were in the Boy Scouts, and we met in the basement of Christ Church. And one day somebody came in, one of the other kids, and they said, some of the bricks have fallen away from one of those structures, and we need to get a flashlight and look to see what was in there. Of course, I didn't know it at the time, but we all did run and look, and there was nothing in there. Those structures were built actually to hide the fact that when you bury someone in the ground, especially years ago, even if they were in a nice wooden casket. Eventually, they collapse and degrade, and the earth falls in and causes a depression in the earth. And the only way to solve those things is to either mound up the grave after it's filled, or else come back and refill afterwards. But this hides the fact that that's going to be happening. That's Holly Johnson's home. This is Captain Thomas Benson. This is the oldest recorded grave or marked grave in the cemetery, and it's right next to a tree. The stone is almost embedded in the tree, and you can see a little 5 on a placard there. That's part of the guided tour, so that you can tell where everybody is. This is the Caesar Rodney Memorial, and you see the flags. He is like the original patriot, and so the flags are there to honor him. And as John Paul Jones said, in life he honored the flag, and in death the flags will honor him. So I'm glad that they keep flags on his grave. I just think that's a beautiful picture of the tree. So. And this is Captain William Phillips's grave, and apparently when they enlarged the church and made some changes, they didn't want to move or disturb his grave, so they built the wall right over his stone. And it's still embedded in there, and I believe the next picture has the marker that denotes who he is, so that you can see when you're on the tour. It's a little hard to see if the sun's not shining, but it's right in the foundation. Also, Governor Sykes is buried in the cemetery there. And these are just some pictures from a distance to give a little bit of perspective on the size of the cemetery, because in the middle of the city you wouldn't expect that there's a lot of room in there, but there is actually a lot of room in the cemetery. And this is an advertisement, and I didn't see him come in, but Mr. Baker, who is a collector, Paul Baker, is a collector of oddities and antiques, and he let me take a picture of this. This was the Wyatt's Furniture and Undertaking Ware Rooms. You'll notice first that furniture is much larger than the undertaking advertisement, because undertaking was not that big a business back then. It was a small town, and very few people were dying. They had to do something else first. Most funeral directors or undertakers came from a history of either cabinet making, so that they could make caskets, or furniture selling, because they had access to furniture manufacturers who were making caskets at the time. And when they started making and manufacturing caskets, it caused a problem, because the funeral directors would buy caskets and store a few of every size, and then they were accused of wishing someone ill will, and so they needed to have them delivered in a timely manner. Down in the bottom script here, which you can't really see on the screen, it says that they are equipped with all the modern conveniences. And what they're talking about is that, and we still have one of these, there was an ice bath. In early 1800s, a couple of brothers, their name were the Tudor brothers, were joking around up in Connecticut looking at a frozen lake and saying that they needed to find a way to sell someone all that ice. And one of the brothers actually did, and they started an ice industry and had hay-packed wall warehouses in a lot of different cities up and down the coast, where people started to use ice, and this is one of the things that they used the ice for. This is a container that had a space underneath the person so that you could put ice underneath of them. The one that we have has a tray on top of it. I couldn't bring that because one, it's huge and heavy. And when my great-grandfather enclosed two of the buildings at the funeral home where we are, this is upstairs. It wasn't being used any longer, and it's almost impossible to get to. So I have taken a couple pictures of it just out of curiosity for people. That's the tray. Well, it's kind of sideways up there, but let's see if the other one is better. That's a little bit better picture. This is the ice tray for the top, and then the window and the body would be at the other end. And it was very important not only to keep the ice from melting as quickly, but from what I've heard and from what I've read from all of the information, it was not a pleasant thing even with the ice. It smelled a little bit, so it had to have the glass top and it had to be contained. And where they distributed the water and the ice after they were finished with it, I'm not sure. But this was an innovation. It was a true innovation because it allowed people to keep a decedent around for at least a week or so that someone from out of town, or they could hold the body until a service was organized. And it was only embalming that would later stop this. And embalming wasn't really accepted until long after President Lincoln took his tour around the country after he was assassinated. This is the small park, which is just across from the old Presbyterian church. And this is where the Wyatt Funeral Home actually was. It was on the corner of High Street and North Street, and Governor's Avenue was High Street at one point. The Presbyterian church was started at Meeting House Square, right there where it is, the old church is now, in 1714. And that's when it was staffed with a qualified staff, whatever that was. I guess it meant that there was a real minister or reverend who was appointed to take care of things there. The brick building was built in 1790. Until that time, they met in a small log cabin that was on the southeast end of the property. There are graves there now. This is what the church originally looked like, the brick structure. And you see the big cylindrical tower that was on the front of it. It was huge. And one of the reasons they did that, they always wanted, people in the town wanted people to know where the churches were. And so almost all of the churches back then had huge steeples on the top of them. This was changed later when they renovated the church. This grave here and the stone is a stone that is there for two people. It's for Ida Dean and her sister Mary Elizabeth Dunning, whose name is on the other side of the stone. They were buried head to head there. They were sisters of Mr. Pennington, whose address was 20 The Green. And they were victims of, from what I've told, the first mailed murder, or the use of the Postal Service for a murder. It was called the Poison Candy Murders, and apparently Mary Elizabeth fell in love with Mr. Dunning, John Dunning, and he got a job as a writer out in San Francisco. They move out to San Francisco, and she's not happy with the way that he's acting in the big city with people, especially I think women, and carousing and drinking. And so she moves back to Dover, and soon after receives a package in the mail of some candies, some chocolates. She and her sister share very few of them and eat almost all of them themselves, and within a day or two they pass away. And there was a note that said, best health to you and baby, or something like that. And they immediately suspected the husband, So they went back out to California, and he immediately threw a woman named Karita Botkin under the bus and said, no, I'm pretty sure that this is your culprit right here. And they did prove it. It took 12 years for them to have the court case to get her convicted. She spent very little time in jail because she died shortly afterwards. And that story, I actually got the information from Sarah Zimmerman, who works over at Rose Cottage, and she has a wonderful little video. It's on YouTube. It was done in cooperation with, I think, WHYY. But look that up. She does a much better job, and there are a lot better descriptions than I have. This is Mary Elizabeth's side of the stone. This is where they lived on the green. It's 20 the green. And it was said that when they had their service, more than 3,000 visitors came to the house to pay their respects. And back in that time, when someone passed away, embalming was available. And it was kind of a new thing, but funeral homes weren't that large. And so where did the embalming get done? Got done in your home, usually in your kitchen, and they would bring this equipment behind me to your home. This is a gravity bottle that is up above what was an embalming table. And they would lay out newspaper or something on the floor to protect your floor and do the embalming right there. And when the embalming was finished, they would clean you, dress you, and put you on a bed. And there you would lay in repose in the parlor of your own home until the service was going to be taken care of. It wasn't until you were going to the cemetery that they would actually put you in a casket back then. So you weren't displayed in it. And this basket here is actually for a child. And this is what they used before they had stretchers. When they would come to your home or to come pick you up to take you back to the funeral home, they would put you in a basket. They didn't have the wheels and the aluminum and the other things that we use today that are so convenient for us and save our backs. And still in the old Presbyterian cemetery, this is one of the oldest marked graves. It's Rebecca Killen. She was the first wife of John Killen. I'm sorry, William Killen. And it's the oldest marked grave, and then the grave that has the youngest decedent in it, and especially at the time, was his second wife, and he had a child, and they named her Rebecca also. So not only is there a Rebecca in the oldest marked grave, but one of the youngest decedents. And the story goes that young Rebecca was out visiting friends. And of course there weren't cars, and she may not have had the use of a buggy or other transportation. And I don't know how far away she was, but a storm broke out. And she had to walk home, and in that she developed pneumonia and passed away, I think, at the age of 15. And all of these stories are also available through the Presbyterian Church. And they've gone through a lot of extensive research to kind of find out who's in the cemetery and what happened to them. And they've tried to mark some things. These are just examples of some extravagant stones that are put up there. A lot of them are beautiful. George Massey, the Crystal Massey family is an old Dover family. Charles Polk, he was a governor of the state of Delaware. And this, again, is another one of these grave enclosures that is over top of a grave. And we had talked about the eventual or imminent collapsing of graves. When out in Chicago, there was a gentleman, his name was Mr. Haas. And Mr. Haas ran a cemetery, and he developed a way to make a concrete reinforced box of two pieces that could be placed into the grave and the lid put on, and it would last virtually forever. The ground would pack around it, and it would keep the surface of the ground, even with equipment rolling over top of it. I took this picture, one for the stone on the right-hand side because it was so beautiful and it had the etchings and the carvings in it. But in the back corner of this picture is a stone that commemorates the victims of plagues. Between 1750 and 1790, there were several plagues that went through Dover. And during these periods of time, people would die at an astounding rate, 2 or 3 a day. And they did not have a place to actually end the time to take care of them, and they did not want to get sick themselves. So they decided that the Presbyterian Church allowed them to have a mass grave where they would use it, and they did not mark the graves, however. And so more recently, in the last few years, they made a memorial stone just to make sure that they were represented in the cemetery and that it was marked out where they were. Some pictures from the cemetery again. This is I don't know if this will actually turn out all right or not, but this is just a video that will go from the Polk stone up to the Hazlitt stone. And Colonel John Hazlitt fought with George Washington on Long Island and White Plains, and was killed in the Battle of Princeton in 1977, and he was buried up in Philadelphia. 60 years later, they disinterred his burial space in Philadelphia and reinterred him at the Presbyterian Cemetery, which that was in 1841. So the science wasn't really there for a lot of things. I was wondering how they did that. I'm a little curious, but it must have been quite a feat to get him from there down to Delaware at that time. This is a stone that just has the linked chains from the Oddfellows organization. Their name still appears on the cemeteries here in central Delaware. There's an Oddfellows cemetery in Camden and one in Smyrna. It was a benevolent organization at the time, and I believe the ring stood for truth, friendship, and love. I'm not sure if I'm getting that completely accurate, but it was an old organization, and they had a place down just off of the green that had their meeting place in the second story of one of the buildings back there. And my great-grandfather was a member of the organization, but to tell you how long ago it went dysfunctional, they were not around when he passed away in the 50s. So, and the story goes with several of the cemeteries is that the people who ran the organizations, or the cemeteries at least, kind of took the coffers and left town. And so they took all the money, and the cemeteries were in financial straits for years and years, and they could never really catch up to have a burial fund or perpetual care fund. The one up in Smyrna and the one in Camden have been bought by Sharon Hills and are currently being run by them. Excuse me. And the one in Milford was bought by the community, and so there's an organization that runs it as a community cemetery. I couldn't find it. We dig graves with machines now. There are backhoes and small instruments that we can get just about everywhere, but every once in a while we still have to dig them by hand. And by we, I don't mean me. But Danny Waite and Dale Iron interns do most of the digging in the local cemeteries. And I couldn't catch him with a hand-dug grave where I could go and take a picture of him, so I did the little artist rendition. This is a description that is made, or this depiction is, it's a sales pitch. This is what the Wilbert Vault Company, Wilbert Haas, took over the concrete burial vault company from his grandfather, and he got the idea to use pitch or asphalt on the outside of them to make them more protective water-wise, to make them water resistant. And so he would encase these concrete vaults, and he marketed it. And they are one of the largest businesses selling what's supposed to be called an outer burial container by the federal government, but most people refer to them to vaults. You place them in the ground and the casket goes inside of them. And this picture kind of shows you how your casket's just going to be ruined if you're not in one, so you need to buy one. Most cemeteries require them so that they don't have to come back and repair the tops of the graves, and also to prevent any liability for someone who would be digging a grave or be there when one eventually collapsed. There's one cemetery in Delaware that does not require one, and that's Old Droyer Cemetery. And however, they do recommend it. So I've only had one, what you would classify as a green burial, and it was in that cemetery. I haven't been back up to see if the grave is collapsed or not, but it was a wooden casket with no frills. Embalming was not really considered viable or socially acceptable for quite some time. And this is a burial vault that had a tower in it. And the tower had a place for a string to go up to a bell tower. And they would tie the string to your wrist or your leg. And that way, if you just happen to, after laying in repose and being buried, wake up, you would ring the bell at the top of the tower moving around. And that's actually where the saying, "Saved by the Bell," comes from. I've never really seen one of these in real life, but when learning that I was doing this talk, Bruce Ennis, the lawyer, presented me with a couple of catalogs that he had collected, or someone had collected for him, of these little cards, and I think they're advertising cards of some type. But this one happens to have the Ferguson and Son Funeral Home on it. Furnishings, undertaking, and this is the first time that it really says embalmers. Embalming came about and was accepted. That's the funeral home right across from the Richardson Hotel, which I imagine would have been a very grand time to have people from the hotel staying so they could go to the funeral across the street, and the horse-drawn carriages taking you to the cemetery. It sounds all very romantic to someone who likes history, but it was probably a lot of work and a little bit of a mess. But embalming came about, and there was a man who very early in history devised a method of embalming by going through a femoral artery in your leg in a certain area that was very easy to find. And his name was William Hunter, and the area where they do that operation even today is called Hunter's Canal. And it wasn't he, but it was the Holmes brothers, two more brothers like the Ice, that went around and taught people how to use this method. One of them was worked for the coroner's office in Washington, D.C., and he became very good at this, and people noticed it, and during the Civil War he was given a commission as captain to go over and embalm the officers and some of the selected, maybe more well-to-do soldiers so that they could be brought home to be buried in their own hometown. This, like I said, is the Ferguson Hayes Funeral Home, or the Ferguson and Son Funeral Home. Frank Hayes married into the family and took it over, and was still there when I came to town to help my father. This is what the building looks like today. It's the Gray Fox. I'm not going to tell you what room the embalming or preparation room was in, but enjoy your lunch. But as attitudes changed, people started to come out of their parlors, having their wakes in their home in their parlor, to going to a funeral parlor. And so funeral homes started to build rooms large enough to accommodate a bed and a few couches. They had elaborate draperies draped around the room, and people could be in repose, usually on that bed, but in a very small space. And as time went on, they started to increase the size of the space so they could also have services there, and so they started to be called funeral chapels or funeral homes. The chapel that was in this building here, if you go in there for lunch, honestly, the body was placed in front of the fireplace that's in there, and I don't know that there was room for 20 or 30 chairs, but Dover was a lot smaller. Funerals were a lot smaller. And my wife and I attended a funeral down in Harrington in a very old funeral home that's right in the middle of downtown. And they have a funeral chapel like the one that was in this home. There was maybe 20 chairs, and then everybody stood around in the surrounding rooms. So it still works today. This is Frank Hayes, who took over the funeral home from Mr. Ferguson. This is my grandfather, William Torbert. And this is the graduation picture from Eccles College of Embalming that was up in Philadelphia. They graduated in the fall of 1932. My grandfather died from a work-related illness. He contracted tuberculosis and died in 1935, about 6 months after my father was born. So my father then was also raised in the funeral home there on Bradford Street. And we do have their graduation picture here, but they were good friends, and we continued when Frank got into his later years. We took care of his funeral business for him, and he would stand at the steps inside the front door of the funeral home and greet everybody as they came in. And eventually he would sit on the steps as you came in. But he was a very nice man. And in their heyday, one of the reasons why my great-grandfather had some business was they were like the upper-class funeral home in town, and they needed someone to fill in the other area of business, and that was my great-grandfather. He was a very reasonable, low-cost funeral director, and because he wasn't really all that busy, we had horses and carriages and the horse-drawn hearse and a stable to keep it right around the corner, so we would provide transportation for their funeral home, and that's how we stayed in business. And the carriage house is still there at our funeral home. It's covered with stucco and other adornments, but it's you can still see in the alley there's a upstairs door that was one of the barn doors where you would open it so that they could put hay in the hayloft. And it again would have been a lot of trouble, especially for a yard that small. I can't see how they kept horses there, but they did, and chickens and all kinds of other things. Wesley Methodist's original cemetery, it's over on New Street and North Street, and it's just catty-corner to the old Presbyterian Church cemetery. It has several different notable graves, one of which is Governor Salisbury, and the spelling of his name changed. The family changed they've flipped the U and the L. Apparently, they had loyalists in their family line, and they didn't want people to associate the SAUs with the SALs from their history. So they changed their name, and he was a physician who went to Delaware, went to college up at Delaware, and then did his medical degree up in Pennsylvania, and came back and was the governor of the state also. He was the head of the medical society in Dover, or in Delaware, and he was also one of the founders of Wesley College. This is more of the cemetery and the actual face of his stone. This is Reverend Richard Watcoat, or Bishop Watcoat. He was born in England and was a traveling minister who studied under John Wesley, and he was sent to the United States along with Reverend Koch to spread the good news of Methodists and the Methodist Episcopal Church. And when he died, apparently over on the green, just a few blocks away, they asked the Philadelphia Conference if it would be okay if they buried him under the altar of the church, which used to be on this property. And they agreed, and when they raised the church and built the new church on State Street, they erected this monument to commemorate him and to actually mark the grave where the altar had been in years past. This is just some artwork that was carved into one of the older stones there, and I thought that, I wasn't sure, but maybe it depicted the church that was originally there, but I don't think that church was actually that big. It was probably a wooden structure. We're going to start to talk about some of the funeral homes. This is the Reese Funeral Home. It's out on Forest Avenue or Forest Street. The building is still there. This is a picture that I took just the other day, but Perry and Irma Reese were 90 when I got out of college, but they had this lovely funeral home, which was big for its time, and they were an African-American funeral home. There were very few people who would cross the racial barrier back then, not because of any set rule, but just because they did it that way. This is just an empty field that's just in back of the Wesley Historic Cemetery, and it is not being used for anything, and they don't allow anything to be done there. I don't know who actually owns or takes care of it, but there's an adjoining church to it now, but supposedly it is an African-American burial ground. There aren't any marked graves on it, but they're sure that there are decedents in there, and because of the times and economics, they would not have had a marked grave there. This is the Abner Coker Cemetery. It's now called the Watcoat Cemetery and is taken care of by the Watcoat United Methodist Church that's out on Salisbury Road. It's at the end of Madison Street, right up on Silver Lake. And at the time of his death, this cemetery did not exist. In his will, he established a couple of funds, one of which was to create this cemetery and to move his remains there, and then to provide spaces for his family also. But it needed to be at least 4 acres, and they found this plot of land at the end of Madison Street. And there are a lot of unmarked graves there, but the newer section in the cemetery is still being used, and there are a lot of modern graves there, and it's a beautiful place right on the lake. And this is one of my favorite stories. This is Ruth Pearson Hall, and her picture is over behind me. One of her nieces loaned us the photos so that we could use this. She was the wife of Lex Hall. Lex Hall was one of the funeral directors around Dover around 1900, and he had one of the first ambulance services in Dover. He would use the hearse as an ambulance and as a hearse, and his location for his business was right at the end of, right across from the hospital, but right next to the exit to Holy Cross Church. And I kind of saved this as video because it's Halloween and the current condition makes it look like a perfect haunted house. But it took me about a month of watching it to see if anyone actually lived there, so that when I went to take pictures that someone wasn't going to run out on the porch. But at one time, it was two separate funeral homes. First it was Lex Hall's, and then later Mr. Trader started his business there. Ruth Pearson Hall, his wife, was an amazing woman. Mr. Hall had a little bit of an issue with fluids, and he was known to have a drink or two. And my father said that in days past he would go out to the football games at Dover High School, which is where the Central Middle School is now, and sit on the hood of his hearse and as an ambulance, just in case somebody got hurt, and he would have a couple drinks while he was there. Other stories is that he was so skilled at embalming that he could embalm somebody through their eyes. That was kind of a scary thing, but it's not really possible, so it's probably just somebody's story. But it makes for good Halloween talk. She, however, was amazing in the fact that when he was not in the condition to work, she did his work for him, and continued to do that, not only the embalming, but ran his operations for him. So, hats off to someone who did that, and they eventually parted ways, and she ended up working for the city in the city building that was eventually moved to this location. She worked in the bottom floor as a secretary or a receptionist, I'm not sure, but an amazing woman. She lived on State Street in the Dublin apartments, and also the apartments that were down on the corner of Division Street and State Street. Lakeside Cemetery was established somewhere around 1860 or 1870, and it started because of the old cemetery becoming filled up. It has a lot of historic graves in it, but because it's so far out of the downtown area and there's so much to talk about, the ones that I will mention are Joshua Wolcott, who was killed in World War II. He was on a ship, it was actually a tug, helping in and around France, I believe, near Normandy and during the invasion there. And he got drug under a destroyer that was coming to, I think, help them or save them. Danny Waite, who takes care of the cemetery up there, does on Veterans Holidays a tour of the cemetery and does a very good job. He's a history teacher, or he was a history teacher. He's a teacher at Caesar Rodney High School now, and he does a very good job of a tour there. So if you get a chance, get in touch with someone who can hook you up with that, and it's very interesting. His family were the people who owned the property across from the hospital where Holy Cross is now. And they bought that property from the Wolcott's family when they moved from downtown on Bradford Street. This is one of those little cards that I showed you from the other funeral home. This is one from the W.E. Smith Funeral Home. This is the one that was right on Lockerman Street. And this is an ad that was found. And William Pritchett, also an undertaker and embalmer, worked for Mr. Smith and took his business over, and then moved to State Street, to a building I'll show you in just a minute. But even in his obituary, it said that he had taken over, he was associated with William Smith. I guess he wanted to give credit where he got his professional education. This is a receipt that I have. Mr. Pritchett moved down to State Street, and my great-grandfather, when he moved to Dover, started in business with him. And so when they were up at that building up there, they were only there for a short time before my great-grandfather found the business location on Bradford Street. It eventually was taken over by Charlie Connor, whose son still lives in the area. His name, he goes by C.B. Connor. And this building is still there. I tried to get a couple pictures of the business when it was in business, and this is a picture of older Mike and young Mike standing at the front door with their sign hanging there. And I believe Mike's in attendance. Thank you for the pictures. My grandfather Covell's funeral was in their funeral home. Mr. Ambruzzo ran it. And again, it was, the size of the chapel was 20, maybe 30 chairs total. And it was just what was expected at the time. This is another photo from a different angle. The Reese Funeral Home that I showed you a little while ago, when the Reeses got to the point where they couldn't do business anymore, they hired a young man from Pennsylvania to come down and help them with their business. And right out of college, he came down and he worked for them for a few years, and things didn't quite work out the way that he thought that they would. And he started opening up small funeral homes in small homes up and down the Eastern Shore. His main location was in Hurlock, and more recently he's renovated the one here in Dover, but he's had several different locations, and he has grown to be one of the largest funeral homes on the peninsula, actually. So he started out with absolutely nothing at all, and it grew to be one of the largest businesses. A lot of credit for his business ability there. This was the Howard Stevenson Funeral Home. It's on Division Street. Howard was an old-time funeral director, an African-American gentleman, and he actually signed my petition so that I could join the Funeral Directors Association when I got my license. He was a very nice man, and I used to do some work for him, and his embalming room was in the basement of his home. And you went through a Bilko door on the outside of the building to get down there. And he would call me from time to time. I had a hard time saying no, but it would take 3 or 4 people to get someone on a stretcher down those steps, and as many to get them back up. But it was a very small building, but again, it was appropriate for the time. This is Holy Cross Church. Originally, this was a brick structure, and it actually connected to the matching brick home that was next to it. It was the rectory. they redid the facade early, I think in the 40s or the 30s. Holy Cross Church had a growth in its population somewhere around the 60s when a lot of people from General Foods moved here. But back in the day, they bought this property from Joseph McDaniel, which his family still lives in the area also. The church was started in 1879 at the downtown Bradford location, and the attached parsonage. Father Tosick, whose grave is in the cemetery. This is Holy Cross Cemetery. He's buried there. He was one of the longtime priests who was in the area. He came down from Wilmington, and he is credited with starting Holy Cross School. He died shortly after he started the school, but he is buried next to, and I had it next to the Mabies, because the Mabies and the Behans are, when Lockerman Street was still viable and a bank wanted to be on the corner of Lockerman and Bradford Street, their home was on the corner, just beyond the corner. And the bank didn't buy their home. They moved their home for them down to the church so that Mrs. Behan could be next to the church. And they moved it on ice blocks with mules, and I don't know how they did it back in the day on ice, but without wheels or something, but that must have been something to see. So she had her place next to the church, and of course, about 50 years later, the church moved. But, and this is the current location of the Trader Funeral Home on Lotus Street. They've been there since 1956. Ross Trader said that he was about 5 when they moved there. And this is the current location of Michael J. Abruzzo Funeral Directors. And that's on the corner of Roosevelt and State Street. And that's our current funeral home in downtown Dover. And self-portrait for a laugh. And thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
No, the people on a Muslim faith, they just wrap them in a sheet and put them in the ground. They have no casket or no burial. Muslims. That's what I showed on TV. They showed somebody that died at a mosque. They had the mosque, but then they just wrapped them up in a sheet and just dug a hole and put them in the ground.
When you're Muslim, there are a lot of different sects and divisions of that church, almost as many as there are of the Christian and Protestant religions. Some of them do that. And I have had a family who actually purchased a casket. We went to the cemetery. They opened the casket, lifted the person out of the casket, and put them in the ground, straight into the ground, wrapped in a linen wrap, and we had to dispose of the casket. So you're correct. Some people do that. Some people will use cremation versus the burial, but there are a lot of different. Also,
they said that might contaminate the groundwater. Is that possible?
No, because usually they're not embalmed. The groundwater would be more contaminated by someone who had been embalmed, because we introduced chemicals like formaldehyde back in the day was considered to be the safest material to embalm someone with, instead of arsenic and rosemary and other turpentine. They used all kinds of things back in the day, but formaldehyde was considered to be safer, but now it's a pretty bad carcinogen, so they're taking it out of everything.
What about the Jewish faith? I know they have like sit and shiver and all that, but do they have similar to No Christian burials now, or?
Actually, the Jewish faith practices the original green burials. They are placed into a casket without any kind of preparation or embalming. There are washing rituals and prayers that are said by members of the church, all under the inspection of a rabbi or a prayer leader, and they're placed into their casket, and the casket is made of unfinished wood and is made with no metal in it. They're deemed to be orthodox by companies or people who are authorized to do that, but there's just glued and pegged together. No hinges or any kind of finish are allowed. The inside has an excelsior or wood shavings if it has anything, and they're dressed in, again, a linen clothing, one appropriate for either a man or a woman, and then they're placed into the ground, preferably without a vault, so that they can go back to nature, earth to earth, and ashes to ashes, and dust to dust. And that's the original green burials, as I call it, because out west and coming across the country, there's a little bit of a call for people to do that again, that they would like to be buried directly into the ground. And in fact, they now market baskets like this to be buried in so that it would disintegrate into the ground with very little impact to the environment.
Anyone else? Yes,
I have a
ma'am.
question. How deep can you make a vault? Like, is there a way that you could have your whole family buried like on top, like in Arlington, or is our water level too high?
Normally, double depth is about as deep as they go, and that's manufacturing-wise. Burial vaults come in two compartments, one for the first decedent and then a spouse. And most veteran cemeteries use double depth. Arlington is double depth. The cemeteries, Delaware Veterans Memorial Cemeteries here in Delaware, at Millsboro and up at Bear, both use double depth burial. It conserves space.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Where I'm from, there's a lot of family farm, like small plots. Are there a lot of those in Delaware where you find small family farm plots?
There actually still are, and some of them have disappeared, which I'm not sure because I wasn't paying attention to whether they have disappeared purposely or if someone was actually disinterred. But I know that there are some that are still small family cemeteries, that, especially if the family still owns the property.
There is a burial ground off of Route 9 going behind the air base. Since they've done renovation, they've enclosed it, I believe, with an iron fence. Do you have information about what kind of burial ground that is or who it was?
I do not.
I think that's Afro-American. I have an old map of Kent County.
Is it an old African-American church?
And
There's no, there never was, well, I don't recall it, there was never a building there that I remember, but there are headstones there.
it goes back a long, long time.
Yes,
Yeah.
Is that on the way to Lipstick? I've seen that with, that's a big wall around
Yeah.
it.
if you get,
Cemetery.
well, if you get off of
Yes,
Route
ma'am.
1 and go right.
A lot of research was done about that particular cemetery before there was actually an enclosure done in order to protect that site. But that's just one of a great number of rural cemeteries, whether they were done on family plots or in African-American communities where the churches and the community have disappeared, have disappeared. The epic of burials, that story just is ongoing.
Bill, if
people are interested in that small cemeteries, they might get a hold of Raymond Dill's book, Souls in Heaven, Names in Stone, or vice versa, which Raymond did extensive research, went out into the woods with probes, probing for tombstones and everything else. And he died just before he finished the book. His brothers finished the book. It's a 2-volume set of Kent County. If you're doing any genealogy, that's a fantastic book because it'll list cemeteries with only 3 or 4 people in them.
And those books are available in the Delaware archives also.
Yeah.
Where do you buy it?
I don't know that you can buy a set now unless you get them on eBay.
They're available at the archives just across
Yeah,
the street.
as far as that goes, but I don't know that you can buy a set unless you get them on eBay.
Yes, sir.
I noticed on the composite for the graduation, looked like all of the directors or graduates were men. I've been to many funerals for many years. I've never seen women funeral directors. Are there any now?
Is Claire, I have one with me. She's helping me today, but yes, there are many funeral directors that are women. In fact, when I went to school, there was probably 85% men and 15% women, and it's almost exactly opposite now. Women are starting to get into the field as second careers sometimes, but yes, there are a lot of women in the profession now. And in this picture, there's 1, 2, maybe that's it. Just there's 2 women in this class, 3.
And what year was that?
1932.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you talk about the changing attitude toward cremation and when it first becomes a form of burial, and also the role of sextons?
Cremation has been around since the beginning of time, and more recently, though, in our more recent history, it's become more available and more affordable, especially. But attitudes towards viewings and visitations over a decedent have changed a little bit. And actually, there's probably about half and half people who decide to choose cremation as a final disposition. As far as the sexton question, sexton of a cemetery has a lot of different implications, but some of them are just there to catalog and to keep the locations of the cemetery named, and so that they know who's where and what's available for sale, to make sure that the rules and the regulations of the cemetery are being upheld. Also, then you have people who are grave caretakers, like the Waite family, who took care of Lakeside Cemetery and almost all of the local cemeteries in town here. They're responsible for digging the graves, setting vaults, making sure that stones are kept straight, because stones actually sit on a foundation. They're not just put right on the ground. There's a concrete foundation that's placed before they're put on the ground. And without that, they would tip back and forth very easily. So, but they each have their separate jobs. Sometimes that job is held by the same person.
Allow funeral directors to own cemeteries. I think Delaware is one of 8 states which funeral directors cannot own a cemetery. Do you have any feelings on that?
I feel that it would be a conflict of interest if a funeral home and a cemetery had some kind of business connection where they were promoting each other. But a lot of states do allow that. I, for one, am glad that they don't here, but, you know, that's personal. And
So you personally would not care to have a cemetery?
I would if someone were to give me a couple of 1,000 acres of ground that I could turn into a cemetery. But other than that, no. And cemeteries are not as big profit as they used to be, and especially with cremation, there are a lot less services. And the services for someone who's being cremated by the cemetery are a lot smaller. Everything is smaller scale, so it doesn't have the profits. They don't have the vault sales. They don't have the tent sales. The tent rentals. They don't have a lot of the things that used to go along with a regular standard casket burial.
Yes, sir.
Is there any vandalism in the cemeteries? Because I grew up in New Jersey next to a large Jewish cemetery, and they'd have episodes where I guess kids would go in there and push headstones over and stuff like that. Do you have situations like that down here?
We do.
Vandalized?
We do. Not all the time, but cemeteries have often been used for parking areas for people who don't have the best intentions, and they have to be shooed off the property. And there are also some people, just recently, for whatever reason, there was somebody who started a small fire next to a stone in Lakeside Cemetery. And why, I don't know, but it does happen. And you just do the best that you can to correct what's happened. And
Many years ago, Charles Moore, M-O-H-R, had been the chief state park naturalist and then went on the faculty when he retired from that immediately at Delaware State University. We were very good friends when he was at Del State. And he was involved when he died in a project for the National Audubon Society on urban cemeteries as wildlife sanctuaries and as sites for finding rare and unusual plants and trees. It was a serious study, and it found a great deal. One of the more interesting cemeteries, by the way, one of the main ones in Wilmington. But for example, there were famous cemeteries in Baltimore and Philadelphia that basically are wildlife sanctuaries, and at one point, people often picnicked in cemeteries, although that isn't common anymore.
No, at one time it was pretty usual for people on a Sunday afternoon to go out and spend time with their deceased relatives, and they would picnic in the cemetery.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
You talked about the trend toward cremation now being roughly 50-50. Are there any other trends, or are you seeing unusual practices or changes in your business in any other way?
With that statistic about 50-50, that 50% of our business involves cremation, not all of that is just what we would call a direct cremation or just cremation. Most of those also include either a memorial service or visitation with the body present, followed by cremation. But that trend is continuing to go that way towards cremation. And I don't think that it is just economics that drives that. I think that it's society and how they feel about it. Although there is more importance on memorializing people with pictures and videos and other memorabilia and staging the funeral home with things from their past. So,
Any other questions? Great, well then, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry, yes, sir. Excuse me.
What's the strangest request you've had for a funeral service?
What is that? Strangest request.
I don't know if it's the strangest, but I showed you the stone for the Mabies that are in Holy Cross. And John Mabie and my father were very good friends. And when he found out that he was going to pass away, he requested that my father get him to church 15 minutes late. He was 15 minutes late for everything. And if you know my father, he was very upset by that someone would think that he was late for church with somebody. The priest did announce that it was his desire to be that way after the fact. But he also did have one of the largest wakes at the time, and that was in the downtown funeral home. After the calling hours were officially over, several of the lawyers and other people in town broke out bottles, and people talk about it still today.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you all for coming.